The temp nursing position at Sacred Heart in Norfolk came with a brief handshake and a folder so thin it barely required a paperclip. Rachel Torres signed 3 documents, her signature precise as a drill manual, her credentials impeccable but deliberately sparse. No references beyond the last 3 years. No employment history before 2021. No explanation for the gaps. The HR coordinator didn't ask. Nobody asked questions anymore. Questions had a way of creating paper trails, and paper trails led to depositions, and depositions led to people remembering things the Pentagon had worked very hard to erase. She moved through the hospital corridors with measured steps, her white sneakers silent on linoleum worn smooth by 1,000 other people's urgency. Sacred Heart's cardiac unit occupied the 4th floor, a place of humming machines and the particular smell of antiseptic mixed with something else, fear, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of people learning that their bodies had betrayed them. Rachel had smelled worse. She had operated in sandstorms where the air itself tasted like blood and dust, where the only machines available were the ones that kept people alive through sheer stubbornness and muscle memory. Here, in the climate-controlled silence of Norfolk, Virginia, she moved past glass-fronted rooms with practiced invisibility. Her station assignment was straightforward, the Northeast Corridor, 5 rooms, routine post-stroke recovery cases. The charge nurse, a woman named Diane with grey threaded through her ponytail and eyes that had seen 20 years of hospital politics, handed Rachel the roster without much commentary. This was a temp position. Temps didn't require the full briefing. Temps came and went. Temps were expected to blend into the wallpaper and keep their questions to themselves. Room 407 contained Commander James Kellerman, age 52, Marines, 2 weeks post-ischemic stroke. The medical chart was thick with neurology consults and cardiac evaluations. His left side was weak. Speech output was slurred but intelligible. Prognosis, favorable. Discharge likely within a week, pending final clearance from the attending physician. Rachel read the chart standing at the nursing station, her eyes moving across the data with the precision of someone trained to extract critical information in under 60 seconds. Commander James Kellerman. The name meant something. She filed that observation away without examining it. She knocked once before entering room 407, a professional courtesy that meant nothing and everything. The man in the bed was lean, the kind of lean that came from a lifetime of discipline rather than illness. Even diminished by a stroke, his posture suggested the weight of authority. His eyes tracked her entrance with the careful attention of someone whose brain was still relearning how to process spatial information. "Good morning, Commander," Rachel said, her voice level and respectful. "I'm Rachel. I'll be monitoring your vitals through the afternoon shift." Kellerman's right hand lifted slightly in acknowledgement. His left hand remained on the bedsheet, the stroke's legacy evident in the minimal voluntary movement. He watched her approach the monitor stand, and something in his expression shifted, not recognition exactly, but the frustration of something hovering just beyond reach, like a word on the tip of a tongue that wouldn't materialize. Rachel reached for the blood pressure cuff. Kellerman's forearm was exposed, the tattoo visible in the fluorescent light. Torres. Sanjin 2011. A medic cross beneath the letters, rendered in precise black ink that had faded slightly with time and sun exposure. Her fingers stopped moving for exactly 1 breath. Then they continued, mechanical and professional, wrapping the cuff around his arm with the efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times. 138/84. Acceptable. The monitor beeped its confirmation, a soft sound like a metronome counting time that no longer mattered. "You doing okay this morning?" she asked, removing the cuff. Standard protocol. Small talk that nurses used to fill the space between bodies and machines, to remind patients they were more than vital signs and neurological deficits. "Tired," Kellerman said, his R slightly slurred but intelligible. "Brain still rebooting." "That's normal. You're ahead of schedule." She checked his full line, verified the medication labels, made notes on the chart. Professional. Competent. Invisible. Kellerman's eyes remained on her face, searching, his right hand moving restlessly across the blanket. The frustration in his expression deepened. Rachel did not meet his gaze. She had learned years ago that some truths could not be acknowledged, some connections could not be made, some debts could not be paid. She pulled her hand back from the monitor and excused herself with a nod. The hallway outside room 407 was the particular kind of quiet that belonged to mid-morning at a hospital. The urgent cases had already been triaged. The visiting hours hadn't started yet. Fluorescent lights hummed in steady rhythm, a sound so pervasive that most people stopped hearing it after the first day. Rachel heard it. She heard everything. Hypervigilance wasn't a disorder, it was a survival mechanism, and she had never managed to shut it off, not in 12 years, and not now. Dr. Sterling arrived for rounds at 10:06 a.m., his shoes clicking against linoleum like a judge's gavel. He moved through the corridor with the particular confidence of a man who had never encountered a ceiling to his ambition. Expensive shoes. A watch that cost more than Rachel's monthly rent. The way he carried his shoulders suggested that every room he entered was his domain until he decided otherwise. He stopped at the nursing station, and his eyes swept across the gathered staff with the assessing gaze of a man cataloguing his subjects. Diane stood to his left, already armed with the day's updates. 2 other nurses flanked the computer terminal, waiting for orders. And there, just beyond the central monitor stand, was the new temp. Rachel Torres. Young enough to be manageable. Quiet enough to be unmemorable. Dressed unremarkably. The kind of person whose presence in a room registered as background noise rather than a distinct entity. Something in Sterling's expression sharpened. Not attraction. Something else. Acquisition. The look of a man who had just identified a new surface on which to exercise control. He didn't speak to her. Not yet. He simply observed her with the careful attention of a hunter evaluating terrain. Rachel felt the weight of his attention the way prey feels a predator's gaze, a primitive response, the hindbrain registering threat even before the conscious mind could process the threat's shape. She continued with her charting, her hand steady, her posture unchanged. She had learned long ago that the first rule of surviving a superior was to give him nothing to grab onto. No ambition that threatened his hierarchy. No competence that challenged his expertise. No personality that demanded acknowledgement. Just a quiet nurse doing her job, the kind of person who could disappear into any room and never leave an impression behind. Sterling turned to Diane. The new temp. Where did she come from? Staffing agency. Her name is Torres. 2 weeks on the floor, rotating assignments. Credentials are solid. Solid. Sterling smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. I like people with solid credentials who understand their place in the hierarchy. Make sure she's assigned to my cardiac cases exclusively. I want to see how she handles pressure. It wasn't a request. It was a test. Rachel understood this without having to be told. Understood that Sterling had marked her as someone who could either be broken or dominated, and he was curious which category she would fall into. She finished her charting and moved to the medication dispensary, where the locked cabinet held the day's supply of cardiac medications. The bottles were arranged in precise order, labels aligned, dosages listed in milliliters and milligrams. Everything had its place. Everything served a function. She withdrew the medications required for Kellerman's afternoon administration, her movements economical and practiced. When she turned to leave the dispensary, Sterling was standing directly in her path. Not aggressively. Just there, occupying space, his presence like a wall she would have to acknowledge and navigate around. Rachel, isn't it? His tone suggested they had already established an intimate connection, though they had not yet exchanged a single word. That's correct, Doctor. You're new to the unit. As of this morning. Well, then. He smiled again, that smile that did not reach his eyes. Welcome to Sacred Heart. I run the cardiac unit. That means everything that happens here, every decision, every protocol, flows through me. You understand? I understand, Doctor. Good. I'm going to be watching you very carefully over the next few days. I want to see how you handle the pressure. The cardiac unit isn't for everyone. Some people are built for this kind of work. Others. He trailed off, letting the implication hang. Others break. Rachel nodded once. She did not blink. She did not look away. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of his assessment with the kind of composure that could only come from having survived things that would destroy most people. Sterling studied her face for a moment, searching for something, fear, perhaps, or submission, or the first crack in a facade that he could exploit. He found nothing. Just a quiet woman in scrubs holding a medication tray, waiting for permission to pass. He stepped aside. Rachel moved past him with the same measured pace she used in every other interaction, her hand steady, her breathing even. She did not look back. She did not acknowledge the tension that had just occurred. She simply continued with her work, the way she had been trained to continue with work for 12 years, through sandstorms and firefights and the kind of darkness that didn't show up in personnel files or official records. In room 407, Kellerman was dozing, his breathing easy, his machines recording the steady rhythm of a body at rest. Rachel administered his afternoon medications with professional efficiency, checked his full line, verified the settings on his monitor. His eyes opened briefly as she worked. Have you been here long?" His words came slowly, each one requiring conscious effort. "No," Rachel said. "First day." Something in Kellerman's expression suggested he wanted to say more, but the effort required to reconstruct speech from a stroke-damaged brain was too great. His eyes closed again. The machines hummed their steady song. Outside room 407, in the hallway beyond, Dr. Sterling was beginning his rounds with the other nurses, his voice carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never had to question his authority or examine the cost of his dominance. Rachel stood at the end of Kellerman's bed and looked at the tattoo on his forearm one more time. Torres. Sanjin 2011. The letters were faded the way letters fade when they are carried on skin through years of sun and wind and the particular weathering that comes from having survived something that statistics suggested should have killed you. She did not touch the tattoo. She did not acknowledge it. She simply made her final note on the chart and left the room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew, with the kind of certainty that came from 12 years of operational security, that Dr. Sterling was now watching her with the specific intensity of a man who had just identified a challenge to his supremacy, and that whatever came next would require her to choose between the safety of invisibility and the very old muscle memory of a warrior who had never learned how to stay down. Dr. Sterling gathered the nursing staff at the nurses' station during morning rounds, leaning against the counter with the casual confidence of a man who had never questioned his own authority. The fluorescent lights cast everything in clinical white, sharp and unforgiving. 3 nurses and a resident turned toward him instinctively, the way people turn toward movement in a predator's direction. "Anyone want to bet how long the temp lasts?" Sterling's voice carried the texture of fine gravel, smooth on the surface but with edges underneath. He let the question hang there like bait. "I give her a week before she's crying in her car, calling her agency, begging to go back to whatever clinic was desperate enough to hire her." He smiled. A smile like a shark showing its teeth. "Nothing personal, sweetheart, just pattern recognition." Laughter rippled through the group, that specific kind of laughter that wasn't quite genuine, the sound people make when authority has already decided something is funny. Rachel stood 3 feet away, updating the admission board with Kellerman's current status. She felt Sterling's gaze lock onto her like targeting reticles. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply marked the next vital sign with the precision of someone logging data from a field hospital under fire, each number exact, each entry deliberate. The room went quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then someone cracked a joke about temp nurses and job security. The group dispersed back to their tasks, and Sterling returned to his rounds with a satisfied expression of a man who had just reinforced the hierarchy. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, Rachel carried her lunch tray through the cafeteria, a simple sandwich, an apple, black coffee in a paper cup that read Sacred Heart in fading blue letters. The cafeteria smelled like industrial disinfectant mixed with something that might have been chicken. She walked toward the corner table where she always sat alone, away from the cluster of staff members who had already decided her status on Sterling's authority. Dr. Sterling was suddenly in her path. He didn't apologize. He didn't stumble. He pivoted with surgical precision, using his shoulder like a weapon, and knocked the lunch tray from her hands. The sandwich tumbled through the air in slow motion. The apple bounced once, twice, then rolled under a table. The coffee cup shattered against the tile floor with a sound like breaking glass, spreading a dark stain across 3 feet of tile. The cafeteria stopped moving. Every voice in the room seemed to cut out at the same frequency. 20 people watched. Sterling stood there, his expression arranged into artificial surprise, as if he had no idea how that had happened. "Oh, so clumsy," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Maybe nursing isn't your calling." He stepped over the spilled food without breaking stride and walked toward the exit as if he had just purchased his lunch and left. Rachel knelt. She didn't shake. She didn't look up. She collected the pieces of the cup with her bare hands, methodically, like she was cataloging forensic evidence. Her hands were steady. That was the thing about hands trained to work in a sandstorm with nothing but a ballpoint pen and a Marine who was bleeding out. They knew how to stay useful when everything else was falling apart. One tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it without breaking her rhythm, without lifting her gaze, without giving anyone in that cafeteria the satisfaction of seeing her break. A younger nurse rushed over with paper towels. Rachel waved her away gently. "I've got it." Her voice was exactly level. The nurse retreated. Rachel finished cleaning, discarded the waste, and walked out of the cafeteria without her lunch, without her coffee, without acknowledging that anything had happened. But everyone had seen it. That was the point. 5 days later, Sterling threw the chart. He stood at the nursing station during morning rounds, Kellerman's chart in his right hand, held like a weapon. Rachel was documenting vital signs from the previous night shift, her focus absolute, her posture the picture of professional neutrality. Sterling moved toward her, and the air in the unit seemed to pressure change around him, the way it does before a storm. He released the chart. It fell toward her feet, pages scattering like white leaves across the tile floor. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice soft and lethal. "Your job is following my orders, not questioning my treatment plans." He stood directly over her, casting a shadow like something blocking the sun. "I run this unit. Not you. Never you. Is that clear?" 6 staff members watched. 2 residents. A surgical tech. 3 nurses. The entire morning cohort was suddenly still, phones pulled out, the way Sterling had ordered. They were documenting. Gathering ammunition for whatever came next. Rachel retrieved the pages. One by one. Methodically. She smoothed each sheet against the counter, collected them in sequence, and reassembled the chart in her hands. She stood. She met Sterling's eyes directly, and when she spoke, her voice came out like iron wrapped in silk, quiet, controlled, and carrying the weight of something he could not possibly understand. "I've carried heavier things than your ego, Doctor." The room went dead silent. Sterling's face flushed crimson, the color rising from his neck like a thermometer spiking in heat. His jaw clenched. He stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to something that was no longer performing for the room. This was personal now, and everyone knew it. "You just made a very stupid mistake, Nurse Torres." Each word came out like a threat wrapped in a promise. He turned to his residents without breaking eye contact with her. "Document every single thing she does from this moment forward. I want timestamps. I want dates. I want a record so complete that when I file the formal complaint with administration, they'll have no choice but to recommend termination." He paused. Incompetence. Insubordination. Patient endangerment due to poor judgment. The residents exchanged glances that said they were uncomfortable with this but understood the hierarchy. They pulled out their phones, opening notes apps, beginning their surveillance. The moment stretched. Rachel held Sterling's gaze without flinching, without looking away, without giving him a single inch of ground. Her composure was absolute. That was what made it terrifying. Sterling turned and walked away, his white coat moving like a cape, his authority suddenly feeling fragile in a way it hadn't before. He had expected tears or apologies. He had expected capitulation. What he had gotten instead was a woman who refused to break, who met his venom with something colder than anger, something that looked like clarity. And then the next 48 hours changed everything. Commander Kellerman's condition began deteriorating slowly at first, then with accelerating precision. His oxygen saturation drifted down, 96% on day 1, 94 on day 2. His respiratory rate climbed from a normal 16 breaths per minute to 22, then 26. Rachel tracked every number like she was reading a warning system designed to whisper before it screamed. She noticed the subtle asymmetry in his chest rise, the way his right side moved less than his left. She noticed the tracheal deviation, that telltale shift of the airway that meant something was collapsing inside him. She paged Dr. Sterling twice. Once at noon. Once at 1800 hours. Sterling arrived the second time with visible irritation painted across his features, as if being consulted about a deteriorating patient was an inconvenience stacked on top of a Tuesday. He examined Kellerman for approximately 90 seconds, listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, checked his pupils, noted the vital signs Rachel had already documented. "Stop bothering me unless he's actually coding, Torres," Sterling said, his voice carrying the weight of dismissal. "Anxiety and post-stroke agitation. His O2 is fine. Get him some Ativan if he's that uncomfortable." He left before Rachel could speak, before she could point out the tracheal shift, before she could articulate what her 12 years of field medical experience was screaming at her brain. Rachel stayed at Kellerman's bedside through the night shift. She sat in the chair beside his bed, monitoring every breath, every change in his color, every fluctuation in his vitals. Around 0300 hours, Kellerman became lucid for a brief window. His eyes focused on her face. His hand moved, grasping for hers with surprising strength. "You remind me." His voice was fractured from the stroke, words slurred and struggling. "Sanjin, there was a nurse, carried me 2 miles. His eyes closed. "You remind me of her." Rachel's composure cracked for exactly 1 second. She squeezed his hand in return, and when she spoke, her voice came out softer than it had in days. "Rest, Commander. I'm right here." By 0600, the deterioration was unmistakable. Kellerman's respiratory rate had climbed to 34 breaths per minute. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, that specific shade that told her oxygen was becoming precious. The tracheal deviation was now visible without palpation, his neck showed the shift clearly. She ordered the portable chest X-ray and reviewed it herself the moment it came back from radiology. Tension pneumothorax. Left side. The lung was collapsing under pressure, pushing his heart toward the right, compressing his remaining functional airway. He had maybe 3 hours before cardiac arrest. Maybe less. She paged the on-call attending. She paged Sterling directly. She paged the cardiology resident. Within 20 minutes, 7 physicians stood outside Kellerman's room, examining the X-ray on the light board mounted in the hallway. 7 doctors. Sterling and 6 others covering the weekend shift. They traced the collapsed lung with their fingers, discussed options in clipped medical language, measured the degree of tracheal shift. Sterling shook his head. Too unstable for emergency needle decompression. The risk of iatrogenic injury is too high. We wait for the thoracic surgeon from Richmond. He'll be here in 3 hours, and we do this in the operating room with full support. One by one, the other 6 doctors nodded. The consensus was absolute. Wait. Stabilize. Transfer to OR when the specialist arrived. It was the safe choice. The protocol choice. The choice that protected everyone except the patient. Rachel stood to the side, waiting. She had learned years ago that there was a specific moment when protocols stopped protecting people and started protecting institutions. When procedures became more important than survival. When the moment arrived to choose between safety and what was right. She waited until Sterling finished his medical explanation. She waited until he turned to walk away from the light board. Then her voice cut through the hallway like a frequency they weren't expecting. "He doesn't have 3 hours, Doctor." Sterling stopped. He turned back toward her slowly, his expression arranged into something that looked like patience wearing thin. "Your opinion is noted and dismissed, Nurse Torres." He didn't even look at her, he looked at the radiology image, at his residents, at the other doctors, at anything except the woman who was standing there with certainty carved into her spine. "We follow protocol. We wait for the thoracic surgeon. That's a direct order." The hallway went quiet. The other 6 doctors exchanged glances that said they were uncertain but wouldn't contradict Sterling directly. Their phones were still out. They were still documenting. Rachel understood in that moment that she was standing at a crossroads. One path led to invisibility and safety, the other led to exactly the kind of visible heroism that destroyed hidden identities. She looked at Kellerman through the window of his room. His chest was barely moving. The monitors showed his oxygen saturation at 71% and falling. His chest was barely moving. The monitors showed his oxygen saturation at 71% and falling. Rachel stood at the threshold of Kellerman's room and watched the numbers descend like a countdown nobody else seemed to hear. Around her, the unit hummed with the routine sounds of a Friday evening, vital sign checks, medication carts rolling down the corridor, the distant ding of the elevator. Nothing urgent. Nothing that suggested a man was suffocating in front of them. She glanced at the clock, 6:36 p.m. She had checked on Kellerman 2 hours ago. His O2 sat had been 89% then, acceptable but sliding. She had mentioned it to the resident on rounds, a nervous third-year named Chen who nodded and made a note and moved to the next patient. That was the hospital rhythm. Slide down slowly enough and nobody panicked. Slide too fast and it became someone else's problem. But this wasn't sliding anymore. This was dropping. Rachel moved into the room with a purpose that felt deliberate, controlled. She reached for the pulse oximeter clipped to Kellerman's index finger, not trusting the monitor's reading. 88%. She waited 10 seconds. 84%. The number flipped again, and something cold slid down her spine, not fear. Recognition. The kind of recognition that came from having sat in a sandstorm outside Sanjin with nothing but a ballpoint pen and the certainty that the patient in front of her would die without intervention. Kellerman's eyes were open but glassy, confused. His breathing had taken on a quality she recognized too well, shallow, rapid, the effort visible in the way his shoulders worked with each breath. His neck veins stood out like cords against his throat. Distension. Early signs of pressure building inside the thoracic cavity. She reached for her stethoscope without thinking, the motion so automatic it came from muscle memory, not decision. She placed it against his right chest wall and heard the familiar sound of normal breath sounds. She moved the diaphragm down. Still clear. She crossed to the left side and pressed the stethoscope against his ribs. Silence. Not absence. Silence was something people talked about when they wanted to sound poetic. This was the complete and total absence of air moving through tissue. A void where sound should have been. The left lung had collapsed. The pressure inside his chest was building against a vacuum, and that pressure was beginning to compress his heart and great vessels. Without intervention, that compression would stop the heart entirely. Kellerman had maybe 10 minutes. Maybe less. Rachel's hand moved to the call button without consulting her conscious mind. She pressed it 3 times, the code for rapid response. Then she grabbed the room phone and dialed the operator, her voice steady, matter-of-fact. Not rushed. The urgency wasn't in her tone. It was in the words, "Rapid response alert, room 4218. Attending physician stat. All available physicians. This is not a drill." The operator's voice came back immediate, professional, calling now. Kellerman's oxygen saturation dropped to 79%. The monitor alarm began its high-pitched shriek, a sound designed to cut through the ambient noise of a busy hospital ward and announce that someone was dying. Rachel turned off the volume with practiced efficiency. The sound would bring people running. The silence would let her think. She reached for the vital signs monitor and checked his blood pressure. 88/52. Dropping. His heart rate climbed higher, 143, 146, the rhythm accelerating as the pressure inside his chest continued to build. The body's last desperate attempt to push blood past an obstacle that was closing down like a fist. She pulled up the chair and sat down beside him, her movements precise, economical. She took his hand, the one with the tattoo of names, the one with Torres ink there like a memory he couldn't quite access. His palm was cold. She squeezed once, maintaining contact, sending the silent message, "I'm here. You're not alone. This exact pressure. This exact temperature." She had done this before in a compound in Helmand province while gunfire spattered the mud walls and the sky turned colors that didn't exist in nature. The room door opened. Dr. Chen arrived first, panting slightly, followed by a surgical resident Rachel didn't recognize. They took in the monitor, the oxygen saturation number, the visible distress of the patient. Chen's eyes widened. Pneumothorax. Rachel nodded once. Chen moved to examine Kellerman, and Rachel released his hand to make space. The resident watched, waiting for direction. Chen's voice came out shaky, "We need to get imaging, confirm its tension." "No time." Rachel's voice cut through, not loud, just clear. Tracheal deviation. Breath sounds absent left side. Decreased on the right. Neck vein distension. This is tension pneumothorax. Imaging is a luxury we don't have. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. It needs to happen in the next 4 minutes or this patient goes into cardiac arrest. Chen looked at her, at this temp nurse he'd seen pushing a medication cart 3 weeks ago. His jaw worked. Before he could respond, Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway with 2 more residents trailing behind him like satellites. Sterling took in the scene with the speed of someone who'd been a physician for 30 years and understood the visual language of dying patients. His face didn't show alarm. It showed ownership. He moved to the monitor, examined the strip, then looked at Kellerman's chest. "Portable X-ray," Sterling said to one of the residents. "Chest film to confirm pneumothorax." "No time for imaging." Rachel's voice again, still steady. "His oxygen sat is 76 and falling. Tracheal deviation is already established. Every second we delay. I am the attending physician on this floor." Sterling's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the tone of a man accustomed to being the final word in every conversation. "I am making the clinical decision. We do not proceed with needle decompression on a patient this unstable without confirmation. The thoracic surgeon from Richmond is 42 minutes out. His oxygen saturation will be 0 in less than 10 minutes. Then we'll intubate him and bag him until the surgeon arrives." Sterling pulled out his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with purpose. Rachel heard fragments of his voice as he stepped into the hallway, still within earshot, still ensuring she heard every word. "Yes, I need you to pull the references on our temp nursing staff. There's an issue with a direct report that I need to document, dangerous insubordination. Yes, she's refusing to follow my explicit orders. I'm concerned about her judgment and her agenda." His voice dropped lower, then rose again. "Thank you, Board President. I'll have everything to you by end of shift." A hospital administrator arrived next, flanked by 2 security officers whose presence changed the air pressure in the room like a weather system moving in. The administrator, a woman named Martinez with the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd been called at home, positioned herself in the doorway. She looked at Sterling, then at Rachel. "Dr. Sterling says you're refusing to follow his treatment orders." Rachel was looking at Kellerman's monitor. 71%. His lips had taken on a bluish tint, cyanosis settling in around the mouth. His respiratory rate was 34 breaths per minute, his body in full panic mode, spending energy faster than his oxygen-depleted lungs could replenish it. She could count the ribs showing through his hospital gown as his breathing became more desperate. She could hear the rasp of air moving through his throat, the sound of a man drowning in gravity. His oxygen saturation is critically low, Rachel said, her eyes still on the monitor. His trachea is deviated. His breath sounds are absent on the left. That's tension pneumothorax. He needs needle decompression. Waiting for imaging is waiting for him to code. Dr. Sterling is the attending physician, Martinez said, not unkindly. His orders stand. If you cannot comply with his treatment protocol, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from this patient. That wasn't a request. That was a threat wrapped in institutional language. That was a door closing. Rachel could feel it in the way the security officer's posture shifted slightly, could see it in the way Sterling stood in the hallway, phone still in hand, already collecting the documentation he would need to justify what was about to happen. She stood. She turned away from Kellerman's bed. She walked to the supply cart in the corner of the room. Every eye in that room was on her, the administrator wondering if she was going to comply, the residents watching the hierarchy reassert itself, Sterling waiting for the moment of vindication where he could tell the board president that she had finally accepted her place. Rachel's hand moved to the emergency equipment drawer. The needle decompression kit. 14-gauge angiocath needle, 25 millimeters of steel and precision, designed for exactly this moment. She straightened, the kit in her hand, and turned back toward Kellerman's bed. Her eyes met Martinez's. I'm going to save this patient's life. You can document that. You can suspend me. You can terminate me. But you will not document that I stood in this room and watched him die. Sterling's voice came from the hallway, louder now, losing its control. Security, remove that nurse from the room immediately. That is a direct order. Rachel moved. Not quickly. Not panicked. The kind of movement that came from knowing exactly where every piece of equipment was, exactly what needed to happen, exactly how long she had to do it. She shouldered past Sterling in the doorway, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just a simple statement of body position that said, I am going to this patient. She stepped into Kellerman's room and locked the door behind her, the click of the lock loud in the sudden silence. The administrator's voice came from the hallway, muffled, call hospital security. Now. The chest X-ray glowed on the corridor monitor outside Kellerman's room. 7 doctors crowded the screen, Dr. Sterling flanked by 6 weekend shift physicians, their collective silence thicker than antiseptic. The image was unmistakable. The right lung had collapsed completely. A white shadow where there should have been air-filled tissue. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. This was the kind of crisis that demanded authority, demanded a name attached to the decision. Tension pneumothorax, Dr. Hayes said quietly. The oldest of the 6, a cardiologist with 32 years at Sacred Heart. He's already post-stroke, Dr. Patel added. Neurology. Her hands were steady but her voice wavered slightly. Aggressive decompression carries significant risk. Sterling nodded slowly, his expression settling into something that resembled concern but looked more like calculation. The risk-benefit analysis is unfavorable. Rachel stood at the far end of the hallway, chart in her hands, watching. Her eyes hadn't left the monitor since Sterling had arrived. I agree, said Dr. Conrad, the hospitalist. Too unstable. We wait for the thoracic surgeon. One by one, they spoke. Dr. Mitchell from internal medicine. Dr. Garrison from emergency medicine. Dr. Lockwood, the intensivist covering ICU. Each name another brick in a wall. Each voice another reason not to act. 7 doctors. 7 voices against intervention. The surgeon's ETA was 47 minutes from Richmond. Kellerman's oxygen saturation was dropping 3% every 2 minutes. Sterling turned to face the group, his posture shifting into the posture of a man who had just solidified his control over the room. We maintain conservative management. Oxygen. Monitoring. We wait for Dr. Brennan and the surgical team. He glanced down the hallway toward Kellerman's room. Step back. Everyone. Let him breathe. Let the system work. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the language of medicine. The 6 doctors dispersed, moving back toward the nursing station or their other patients. Protocol satisfied. Responsibility distributed. No one person held the weight of what happened next. Rachel turned and walked into Kellerman's room. Her badge was already unclipped from her pocket, her hands already moving to open the monitor display. The numbers hit her like a second heartbeat: oxygen saturation 78%. Pulse 127. Blood pressure 94/61 and dropping. His neck veins distended against the side of his throat like ropes pulled taut. His skin had taken on the pale, waxy quality of someone whose oxygen was running out. She watched the monitor as the numbers ticked downward. 77%. His breathing had become shallow, rapid. The sound of it filled the room, that terrible wet wheeze of lungs trying to inflate against a barrier they couldn't push through. Pain was data. His pain told her everything. The deviation of his trachea to the left, visible now when she looked at his neck, meant the pressure in his chest was building. Meant his mediastinum was shifting. Meant he had minutes before his heart would begin to fail under the weight of it all. 76%. Kellerman's eyes found hers. He was still conscious. Terrified. She saw his mouth open to speak and knew he was struggling for air, that every breath was a negotiation with his own body. She pulled the portable ultrasound from the cart, the one they called the phone because it was the fastest way to see what you needed to see without waiting for radiology. A single glance at the screen showed her exactly what she already knew. The right hemithorax. No lung slide. No movement. Confirmation. She did not hesitate. Her hands moved to the tray with the equipment. Sterile field already in her mind. The second intercostal space. The midclavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks on his exposed chest with the precision of muscle memory that had been carved into her body in a sandstorm 13 years ago. She had done this procedure exactly once before in a way that mattered. It had been dark. The wind had been carrying sand and the smell of diesel exhaust and something copper that might have been blood. Her hands had been shaking then. They did not shake now. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand. She prepped his chest with antiseptic in 3 fast circles. The cold of it made Kellerman flinch. "I've got this," she said. The needle went in. Perpendicular. Controlled. Her thumb and forefinger guided it past the skin, past the fascia, until she felt the precise give of the pleura tearing. The hiss came immediately. A rush of air escaping. A sound like a tire deflating. Kellerman gasped, actually gasped, his body responding to the pressure releasing from his chest. She withdrew the needle, left the catheter in place, and taped it down. Her movements were economical. Nothing wasted. Nothing uncertain. The monitor beeped twice, then showed the numbers changing. The oxygen saturation climbed. 79%. 82%. His breathing deepened. His color began to return. The terrible pale waxy quality of his skin was already shifting toward something closer to normal. The tracheal deviation was already correcting itself as the pressure equalized. 86%. Kellerman's eyes closed. His hand reached out and gripped her forearm. No words. Just pressure. Just acknowledgement of a body that had been given back the ability to breathe. She placed a chest seal over the catheter and stepped back. The monitor showed his saturation climbing still. 91%. His heart rate was dropping. His blood pressure beginning to stabilize. The room fell into a quiet that felt sacred. Then the door burst open. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway with the hospital ethics investigator on his left, a woman named Patricia Klein with a camera on a tripod that was already rolling. Behind them were 2 security guards. Behind them were the 6 doctors, their faces showing varying degrees of shock and something darker. Something like having been forced to watch someone overturn a decision they had all made together. Sterling's face was not shocked. Sterling's face was triumphant. "You just ended your career," he said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. That made it worse. The ethics investigator stepped forward, the camera's red light blinking steadily. "Nurse Torres, you are hereby suspended pending termination for gross insubordination, practicing beyond your scope of practice, and reckless endangerment of a patient." Rachel removed her badge from her pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate. She looked at it for a moment, her photo, her temporary credential, the certification that had allowed her to work within these walls and be treated as invisible. She held it out. Sterling took it. His fingers closed around the laminated card like he was closing his fingers around her future. "I told you nursing wasn't your calling, sweetheart," he said as she moved past him toward the door. The ethics investigator was still recording. The 6 doctors had stepped back to let her pass. No one made eye contact. No one offered a word. The next morning came grey and loud with the sound of rain hitting the parking lot like applause that would never become a welcome. Rachel sat in the VA hospital waiting room as a patient. Follow-up appointment for an old shoulder injury she had ignored for 6 years. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that made her jaw clench. The waiting room was full. A Marine in dress blues reading a 3-month-old magazine. A woman in Army combat uniform with a service dog. 2 Navy sailors in khakis. A man whose face still showed the patchwork scars of something IED-related. She recognized 2 of them. Not by face alone, but by something deeper. The way the young Marine carried his weight. The way the sailor with the left arm wore his empty sleeve. Muscle memory in their movements. She had stitched cuts on people who now sat 3 chairs away. She had held their hands while they waited for surgery in field hospitals that smelled like diesel and human fear. In 2011 and 2013. In places that no longer officially existed. They did not recognize her. Rachel pulled the patch from inside her jacket lining. The 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade emblem. Faded from 13 years of being pressed against skin. Worn thin at the edges from being clutched in a closed fist too many times. Commander Kellerman had pressed it into her palm after she had dragged him 2 miles through contested terrain with bullets cracking overhead. They had not spoken. There was no time. But he had given her this. Proof. Evidence. She held it in her hands and her hands trembled for the first time since she had become invisible. A nurse called a name from the doorway. Rachel Thompson? That was not her name. That was the name the Pentagon had given her when they erased the other one. That was the name on her doctored intake forms. That was the identity that allowed her to work and live and breathe without causing problems for people who did not want to know her true story. She stood. Here. No one looked at her. No one saw her. In a room full of warriors, she was the most invisible of all. A phone vibrated against her hip. Then another phone. And another. The Marines glanced at their pocket notifications simultaneously, that synchronized military response. Rachel's phone had not vibrated. Rachel's phone had no one calling it. Rachel's phone was registered to an identity that did not actually exist. The Marine in dress blues looked up. His eyes met hers for exactly 3 seconds. She saw something flicker there. Recognition. Not of her face, but of something else. The way a person carries themselves when they have seen things. When they have done things. When they have left pieces of themselves in desert countries that Americans were not supposed to be talking about. He nodded slightly. She nodded back. Then she followed the nurse through the door toward her appointment, toward the waiting room where she was a ghost among ghosts, toward a future that the Pentagon had promised would begin the moment she accepted her new name and learned to accept invisibility as a form of protection. But invisibility, Rachel Torres had learned, was never meant to last. The phone in Dr. Sterling's hand was already glowing with the cardiac unit's automated incident report before Rachel finished securing Commander Kellerman's chest tube. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who understood that documentation was power, that speed was leverage. He stood in the hallway outside the patient's room, the fluorescent light casting his face in shades of clinical white, and dialed the hospital board president's private line. Not the answering service. Not the administrative office. The home number he'd obtained 3 years ago at a charity gala where power networked with power over champagne that cost more than a nurse's weekly salary. The board president answered on the third ring, voice thick with sleep and irritation. Sterling didn't apologize for the hour. Apologies were for people without authority. We have a nurse here who's violated chain of command, performed an unauthorized invasive procedure, and directly contradicted 7 attending physicians on a critical patient. The number hung in the air like a blade. 7. Not 3. Not 4. 7. I need this documented before she can claim she was acting on anyone's orders. I need her references pulled and every credential verified. She presented credentials that are deliberately sparse, and I need you to understand that this hospital may have just hired someone without proper clearance. Within 90 minutes, Sterling had made 6 calls. The first went to the sparse list of references Rachel had provided during her onboarding, 2 previous facility supervisors and a clinical educator from a hospital network in San Diego that had closed its cardiac unit 3 years prior. The second call went to a former colleague from Sterling's residency who now ran compliance at the medical board. The third initiated a full credentialing audit. The fourth brought the hospital ethics investigator to Sacred Heart at 2:11 a.m., a woman named Dr. Helena Reeves who believed implicitly in protocol, in hierarchy, in the sacred order of medical decision-making that kept chaos at bay. Rachel knew what was happening because she'd seen this before, different cities, different antagonists, but the same institutional machinery grinding forward with relentless precision. The ethics investigator appeared at the cardiac unit in trance as the night shift turned to early morning, carrying a tablet and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been roused from bed by a board member's urgent request. She moved with the calculated slowness of bureaucracy, reviewing the emergency procedure log, requesting the x-rays, asking for Rachel's credentials file, each question a small brick in a wall that was being constructed around her. You performed needle decompression without attending physician authorization, Dr. Reeves said, not as a question but as a statement of recorded fact. Her voice carried no judgment, which somehow made it worse than anger. The patient's oxygen saturation was 68 and falling, Rachel said quietly. Tracheal deviation indicated tension pneumothorax. 6 minutes maximum before cardiac arrest. That's clinical assessment. Chain of command is institutional structure. Dr. Reeves made a note on her tablet. Dr. Sterling and 6 other attending physicians examined the same patient and decided on conservative management. 7 doctors were wrong, Rachel said. Her voice didn't waver. Her hands remained steady. The composure that had kept her alive in Sanjin held firm in this sterile hallway. The patient would be dead if I'd waited for a surgeon flying in from Richmond. Dr. Reeves looked at her then, really looked at her, and in that moment Rachel understood that it didn't matter. The facts didn't matter. The patient's survival didn't matter. What mattered was that Rachel had broken the code. She had violated the unspoken agreement that kept junior staff subordinate and senior staff protected. She had made 7 doctors look incompetent, and the institution would have to choose between acknowledging her competence or protecting their hierarchy. The hospital chose hierarchy. By 6:41 a.m., Rachel had been suspended pending termination. The paperwork cited unauthorized medical procedure, violation of chain of command, and a potential risk to patient safety despite outcome. The language was careful, administrative, designed to bury truth under the weight of process. Commander Kellerman had survived. His oxygen saturation had climbed from 68 to 96. His chest tube was draining properly. His heart monitor showed a strong sinus rhythm. But none of that appeared in the suspension documents. Sterling stood watching as security escorted Rachel from the building, his arms crossed, his expression carrying the satisfied weight of a man who'd successfully protected his dominion. He didn't smile. Smiling would have been beneath him. Instead, he simply nodded to the security officer, a small gesture of authority acknowledging authority. Rachel walked past him without looking, her bag carried at her side, her credentials badge already removed from her lanyard and left on the nurse station desk. She didn't cry in the parking lot. She didn't cry in her car. The tears would come later, in private, where composure was no longer required. The next morning, Rachel sat in a waiting room at the VA Medical Center in Portsmouth, surrounded by the ghosts of her own war. An older man missing his left arm sat reading a newspaper with his right hand folded on the armrest. A woman in a wheelchair with burn scars mapping the left side of her neck stared at the wall calendar. A young Marine, no more than 22, scrolled through his phone with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose body was here but whose mind hadn't returned from wherever it had been sent. Rachel had treated patients like them in field hospitals that smelled like copper and diesel and desperate prayers whispered in languages only the dying understood. She had held their wounds together. She had coaxed them toward survival. She had earned the right to stand among them, to claim them as her brothers and sisters. But she had no official proof of any of it. Her appointment was routine, a psychiatric evaluation, mandatory follow-up from her disappearance file, the Pentagon's way of ensuring that the ghosts it created stayed functional and quiet. The VA psychiatrist was a competent older man named Dr. Okafor who'd served in the Navy himself and who asked the right questions in the right tone. But even his understanding couldn't change the fundamental reality: Rachel Torres legally existed in paperwork only, a non-entity created by the same institution that had saved her life by erasing it. She sat in the waiting room for 90 minutes after her appointment ended, not because she was waiting for anything, but because she had nowhere else to be. Her apartment was temporary. Sacred Heart had already begun the termination process. Her bank account held enough savings for 6 weeks if she was careful. Her phone had no one to call and no one who could call her. The Pentagon had made sure of that when they'd given her a new social security number, a new driver's license, a new identity buried so deeply that even a background check would come back empty. Her hand moved to the inside of her jacket lining without conscious thought, fingers finding the faded 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade patch that Kellerman had sewn there in Landstuhl 18 years ago, when his memory was still intact and his gratitude still acute. The embroidery was worn at the edges. The fabric had faded from deep blue to something closer to grey. She'd carried it through 3 deployments, 3 extraction missions, 3 times when she'd dragged broken men to safety while bullets carved the air around her head. She'd carried it through her forced retirement, through her vanishing, through her reinvention as a nurse in Norfolk. She'd carried it as proof of something, though proof to whom remained unclear. She pulled the patch from the lining and held it in her palm, feeling the weight of 18 years compressed into a rectangle of deteriorating cloth and thread. No military unit would recognize it as official. No institution would accept it as documentation. No amount of careful explanation would make this patch mean anything to anyone who hadn't been there, hadn't seen what she'd done, hadn't survived because she'd refused to let them die. This was rock bottom. Not the suspension. Not the termination. Not the destruction of another career in another city. This was the moment when invisibility stopped being protection and became erasure. This was the moment when the thing that had kept her alive, the ability to disappear, to be overlooked, to operate in the margins where authorities' gaze couldn't reach, revealed itself as a cage. She was alone in a waiting room full of her own people, and she couldn't claim them. She couldn't tell the 22-year-old Marine that she understood what he was carrying, that she'd carried similar weight, that he would eventually find his way back to solid ground. She couldn't tell the woman with the burned scars that flesh heals but memory takes longer. She couldn't tell the older man with one arm that loss becomes knowledge if you're careful with it. She couldn't claim any of them because claiming them would require existing, and she was deliberately not existing. The patch remained in her hand as she stood to leave the waiting room, as she walked past the VA staff, as she moved toward the parking lot where her ordinary car waited in an ordinary space. She folded the patch carefully and returned it to the inside of her jacket lining, securing it with the same precision she'd used to perform the needle decompression that had saved Commander Kellerman's life. The patch was all she had. Not proof. Not documentation. Not recognition. Just a small piece of faded cloth and the knowledge that she'd earned the right to carry it, even if no one else could ever verify that claim. The waiting room door closed behind her with a soft hiss of hydraulics. She didn't look back. Behind her, the 22-year-old Marine glanced up from his phone, and for just a moment, something in her bearing caught his attention, the way she moved, the invisible weight she carried, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd been somewhere that most people would never go and come back from a place that most people couldn't survive. But by the time he focused on the door, she was gone, another invisible person moving through a hospital meant for people like them, another ghost among ghosts, another veteran that the system had both saved and erased in equal measure. Rain began to fall as she walked to her car, drumming against the windows like applause for a performance no one had witnessed. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time before turning the key, hand steady on the steering wheel, face composed in the particular way that soldiers learn when emotions have to be filed away in compartments labeled later and never. The 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade patch rested against her ribs beneath the jacket, proof of something that the world would never acknowledge, validation that only she could provide to herself. She had no family to call. No military record to claim. No hospital position to return to. She had a patch, a skill set that no civilian institution could safely utilize, and the knowledge that somewhere in this city, Commander Kellerman was recovering from his stroke, his life saved by a procedure that had cost Rachel everything she'd rebuilt over the past year. He would get better. He would return to his family, to his career, to a life of normal privilege and proper recognition. She would find another city, another temporary job, another identity so carefully constructed that no one would ever know what she'd carried through their doors. The rain fell harder and Rachel Torres, who was legally no one, pulled out of the parking lot toward a future that the Pentagon had promised would begin the moment she accepted invisibility as protection. But invisibility, she'd finally learned, was never meant to last. If you're enjoying this, please hit like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from.